Okay. So our next minerals that we're going to talk about are the potassium, sodium, and chloride. Do you guys know another name that you could classify these three minerals as?
Salt.
They're salts, but
Electrolyte?
electrolytes. So these are mainly maintaining your electrolyte balance. They're important for our osmotic pressure. And in addition, they're important for maintaining our acid-base balance. So our acid-base balance is maintaining our pH. What's our physiological pH we want to maintain?
7.2?
Close, a little higher than that,
7.6.
right in between.
4.
7.4. So 7.4 is the acid-base balance. So we utilize sodium chloride and potassium to do that. These are also critical for proper nerve impulses. So that our nerves functioning, we actually are pumping out sodium and potassium to change the voltage of that nerve to send the signal down. So potassium, sodium, very, very critical for our nerve impulses. We also need them for our nutrient passage and uptake. So specifically, sodium is probably, well, sodium and potassium here are the more critical ones. So we have, so for instance, to take up glucose, we use our sodium, glucose, transporter, transporter 1, this is also known as SGLT1. So we end up having, is it 2 sodiums? Bind this, and then we're able to add 1 glucose. And then that causes the SGLT1 transporter to flip, and once it flips, it releases the glucose, then it releases the sodiums. And when that's done, it flips back the other way. So without sodium in your diet, you can't absorb glucose. So if you ever think of the various performance drinks such as Gatorade, right? Gatorade, is that Florida State? Which one's the Florida Gators? Is that
Yes,
Florida?
yeah.
So they're the ones that came up with Gatorade, and they had to have electrolytes in that. The reason why they had to have electrolytes in with the glucose is because you need to have the electrolytes. And usually when you're in a high performance situation like that, you've been sweating, and what's coming out when you sweat?
Sodium.
The salt, so sodium chloride is coming out. So you end up not having enough sodium to absorb the glucose. So you can't have taken the food without also having the sodium. You'll also notice a good example of when things go wrong with your electrolytes. See, in December there was a very moving video of at this marathon. I don't remember which marathon it was, but there was this woman who was, I think, in her mid-30s, trying to get to the finish, and there's the high school girl that helped her, and the high school girl was part of a relay, so she didn't run the full 26. She ran a half, so she helped the woman, and that woman ended up winning the women's overall component of the marathon, but she couldn't move anymore. So why couldn't she move? Because she had lost her electrolytes. She didn't replenish enough of her electrolytes as she was running, so she lost her nerve impulses, so then she couldn't physically move anymore. So that's where you get those differences that you end up seeing. When we're looking at formulating in a diet, we want to have a balance. So typically we're going to take sodium plus potassium minus chloride. Why do you think I have it sodium plus potassium minus chloride? What are the charges on sodium and potassium?
All the fluorines, maybe.
So we have our two positives that we're adding together, and then we're subtracting out our chloride. So this electrolyte balance is sometimes referred to our DEBs, and that's our dietary electrolyte balance. So you'll have some people in their formulations, they actually formulate for DEBs. I have a calculation in my formulation software where I calculate dietary electrolyte balance. So you have your sodium plus potassium minus chloride. There are other minerals that can be incorporated into this equation, but they're minuscule, so we end up leaving them out. Ideally, we want this electrolyte balance. I know I have pig there, but it's also the same for poultry. We want it to be probably around 220 to 250. So this is where it ends up being a, looking at formulations where you can have different issues. So if I formulate, let's say, just to meet my sodium requirement, what do you think my primary source of sodium is going to be in the diet?
Sodium chloride?
Sodium chloride, also known as
Salt, table salt.
table salt. So if I use table salt, if I formulate just for my sodium, don't really worry about potassium, and I'm using salt for that. And salt is essentially, think of it 50-50 sodium chloride. So if I end up putting 50-50 sodium and chloride, what do you think it's going to do to my electrolyte balance? So it's going to neutralize it, so it's going to end up being lower than that 220 to 250. So you want to be careful not to have your sodium requirement met solely by salt. The part of the reason for that is if you don't also account for this chloride, you're going to get this result called flushing. You guys know what flushing is?
Flushing?
Yeah, in poultry.
Yeah, on the cattle with embryos.
So what do you know flushing with cattle? What is that?
Like the embryo, like when you flush them.
Oh, okay. So this ends up essentially being diarrhea. It's not like true diarrhea, but it's very wet stool, wet digesta. And that's because you end up altering the osmotic pressure within the lumen, and so you need warm water to go with it. So having our diet formulated only for sodium and using table salt as our primary source, that's gonna result in wetter litter. Is that beneficial for the birds
No.
to have wet litter? Why not?
Isn't that what
But I mean,
source?
that was, yeah,
So it's ammonia source, what else can happen with that?
it just makes the floors wet, easier for them to slip and break on
So they're more prone to injury. What, if you have wet litter with ammonia, what do you think that's gonna do to their feet?
it. Oh, it's not crazy, They're like.
What's that
burn.
called?
The actual-
Foot pad dermatitis. So it's gonna burn their foot pads. So what's another, can you guys think of another, another ingredient we can add to a diet? So instead of having our sodium requirement matched solely with table salt, can you think of another thing that we can add?
Sodium bicarbonate.
Sodium bicarb. So that's the other thing. So you use a little bit of salt and a little bit of sodium bicarb, and that helps maintain our electrolyte balance and keeps it higher.
What was it called?
They're able to essentially breathe that out.
Why don't you put full sodium bicarbonate in? Like, why do you use table salt at all?
Because you still need the chloride, because
It's just easier to do it that way instead of just adding.
I mean, you could, there are other sources, you could do, I suppose, add potassium chloride with sodium bicarb, but you still have a nutritional requirement for chloride. So you don't want to completely discount that. You have the requirement for chloride. That's important too. So we don't want to completely eliminate chloride out of the diet. So that's why you'll put in some salt, because salt's probably the cheapest. And then you balance it out. You add a little bit of sodium bicarb in to increase the DEBs. Alternatively, you can add some potassium carbonate, is another thing. So like Dr. Brake, he's been having his group to look at woody grubs, because he formulates diets off of a high salt diet. He does high salt, so they've had some issues. So they've been adding potassium carbonate. What are they doing? They're increasing their DEBs, and that's what ends up solving their problem. So that's essentially what we want. We're trying to get between 220 and 250 dietary electrolyte balance. A deficiency toxicity is a little more difficult to produce. I mean, typically you're going to see it if, the main way you're going to see it is if the feed mill messes up and someone forgot to hit the add salt button, right? Or that's the main way that you're going to get a deficiency. You just completely failed to add any salt into the diet. Toxicity, the main time that you're going to get toxicity is if you don't allow the animals. If you put too much salt in it, it should be okay. The birds just need to have access to water, because that's how they're going to maintain their osmotic pressure. They're going to have to drink more, and that drinking more is that's also leading to the flushing, so they're going to have wetter litter. But those are the things that you're going to encounter deficiency and toxicity. Now we're going to go into the specific components of each of these three. So potassium is the third most abundant mineral on planet Earth. It specifically is important as part of this electrolyte balance. It's important for neuromuscular function. So this is the the neuromuscular function. If you think of, if you've ever exercised a lot and maybe the next day you get like a Charlie horse, your muscle spasms and it hurts really bad. And what do people tell you to do?
Drink water and stretch it.
Drink water, and what else? What should you eat?
Mustard juice.
Okay, I haven't heard of those. Not salt. There's a fruit. Bananas. Bananas are high in potassium. That's why at all races there's always bananas. So the potassium is critical for that neuromuscular function. That's the main one that's causing the charge. Potassium is the primary intracellular cation. So this is contributing to the osmotic pressure and the gradients that we are utilizing. So what does cation mean? Positive charge. So this is the principal mineral in the cell that has a positive charge. So in the cell is providing the positive charge. It is also a cofactor in pyruvate kinase. So that's phosphorylating pyruvate. If you're deficient specifically in only potassium, you're going to get things like anorexia, rough hair, you're going to reduce your heart rate, and you're going to have weak muscles. So toxicity, you really don't get toxicity with potassium because your body can excrete it out pretty easily. We can tolerate about 10 times the requirement. Okay. So our next one is sodium. Sodium is our principal extracellular cation. So what does that mean? The cation again means what? Positive charge, extracellular, where does that mean? Where is it? Outside of the cell. So it's in the extracellular fluid, potassium's in the intracellular fluid. It makes up about 2% of your body. It makes up 93% of your body bases. Metabolism, it controls aldosterone. So aldosterone is the hormone that is controlling your osmotic pressure, your blood pressure, okay? So the amount of sodium in your blood is controlling your aldosterone. So this is one of those reasons why sodium and water go hand in hand, right? So your body wants to maintain the amount of sodium in the extracellular fluid and within the blood. If that ends up getting too diluted, then you run the risk of getting this thing called hypoatremia. I think you guys heard me talk about hypoatremia before. Do you remember where? So this is also known as, so this is sodium deficiency. This is also known as water toxicity. So, if you end up having low sodium within your blood, your aldosterone signals to the kidneys that we need to absorb or reabsorb more of the sodium. So we don't want to excrete that out in the urine. The risk that we run with that if we don't address the sodium deficiency or our low blood sodium or our water toxicity, you end up getting this with disrupting the osmotic balance. So now if you have low sodium in your blood, which is going to result in low sodium in your extracellular fluid, what does that do to the cell?
Does that make it swell?
It's going to make it swell. So we have a change in the osmotic pressure, right? So you're going to have water influx into the cell trying to equalize that out. What happens if you have the cell start to swell?
First.
It's gonna burst. And you can have some of the, especially with the hyponatremia, you end up getting the, you end up getting the swelling of the aorta, and it actually ends up cutting off all the blood supply to your brain. It's one of the reasons why in this situation you always end up getting a massive headache, because your brain's starved for oxygen. And our deficiency is you get, if you don't have adequate sodium, you're going to have decreased growth. You're going to get the diarrhea, decreased feed intake, and decreased egg production. So sometimes the feed intake, you can almost think of it as even though chickens can't taste that well, it's gonna, just like you're going to put more salt on your food, or typically you're adding salt to your food, it accentuates the taste. But if you ever think of why we evolved to like that, it's because we need the sodium. Sodium is very critical for many aspects. Toxicity, if you have too much toxicity, too much sodium, you're going to run the risk of hypertension. What's another name for hypertension? Not headache. I mean, it can cause a headache. High blood pressure. So if you have, essentially, if you have too much sodium, you're ending up reabsorbing more water, which ends up making more pressure in your veins. If you're deficient, you're going to get hypotension. You're going to have low blood pressure because of the osmotic balance. Nervousness, weakness, seizures, paralysis are some of the toxic signs.
What, how much, like, would that just be like chugging a thing of like table salt?
This is gonna be, you go and drink ocean water for consecutive days.
Okay. I was like, I've never heard of paralysis being a side effect. I was
So-
shocking.
The biggest thing is having too much sodium is okay if you have free access to water. So you're almost gonna think of it, you go to the movie theater and you get a big thing of popcorn and you put extra salt on it, right? And if you forget to get a drink, or if you're being a little too cheap, it's not gonna take long before you decide, after eating a large bucket of popcorn, that I'm gonna splurge an extra $5 and get like a 64-ounce malt soda that they sell, right? If you have adequate water, you're not gonna get sodium toxicity. It's when you have high salt, high sodium, and you don't have the water available. This is where you're gonna get those problems. So you limit the water and you have high salt, that's the issue.
Is this one of the stresses, like if you have a house that, like the water stops working, or the heat's too high?
Yeah.
Is this one of the reasons that, you have a lot of birds die? Or is it more just the stress of the heat?
That's more or less the stress of the heat, it's not so much the salt. But if you are on, because there are like salt plains naturally within all throughout the US. So if you happen to have your house, your complex, where there's a high sodium concentration within the water, okay? And you give them a normal diet, which is supplemented with the 0.2% sodium, you're going to cause a sodium toxicity. So if you have high sodium in the water, you need to reduce the sodium in the diet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like feed meals, so like, how do you get that? Will they just go and make like a low sodium batch and normal sodium batch?
Yes, that's what the nutritionist, so the nutritionist knows where the houses are, a good nutritionist knows the different houses, what the water quality is like, and they will have formulas. So let's say it's a starter diet. All their starter diets are code 1000. So normal diet, normal starter is 1000. If you need a low sodium because you have high sodium in the water, you're going to have it 1010. If you have low sodium in the water, you may have 1020. So then you're able to, that one may have a little higher sodium in it. Does that make sense?
I was just wondering how they like.
So it's not so much the feed mill, it's the nutritionist is telling the feed mill, I need you to make this many pounds or this many tons of diet 1010. The next one, I don't know why I didn't have chloride in there. Chloride, for the most part, is, I like to think of it as a sodium sidekick. It kind of goes wherever sodium does. Chloride is the extracellular ion. So it's not a cation, it's that, well, it's the anion. So it's the negative, it's extracellular cation, or anion. So that's where you're going to find it. All right, our next is sulfur. So sulfur makes up about 0.15% of the body. It's primarily in the body as amino acids. You guys know the 2 amino acids that have sulfur in them?
Is it thymine?
Yes.
I don't think it's lysine, but it's really
It's not lysine.
I think it starts
Is
with
it
T.
cysteine?
Cysteine. These are our 2 sulfur amino acids. These are the ones that make up our disulfide bonds. Which are required for tertiary protein structure. So there's real no requirement for them because they're absorbed as amino acids. You can add other sulfur sources as inorganic sources. So chondroitin sulfate can be an inorganic source. I don't know anybody that actually adds sulfur to the diets. If you have excess, you're gonna excrete it in your bile and urine. If you have a deficiency, it's because you have a deficiency in your sulfur amino acids. So your deficiency in sulfur is essentially having a methionine deficiency or a cysteine deficiency. So with that, you'll have poor growth, poor feathering, smaller eggs if we're talking about laying hens. So those are the primary deficiency symptoms of sulfur. So for this, know that it's coming from methionine and cysteine. All right. Our next one is iron. Iron, what do you guys know about iron?
It's needed in blood.
It's not provided in milk, so like I know pigs have to give an iron shot, whether it be iron deficient when they're born.
Okay, so pigs, they get an iron shot when they're born. You need it in the blood, so 60 to 70% of the iron that you find in the body is in your red blood cells. That's what RBC stands for, is red blood cells. You have an additional 20% that's stored in the liver, spleen, and bone. Spleen makes sense because this is essentially where we're recycling our red blood cells, or clearing out all of our old red blood cells. So we're kind of using those as a storage of our iron. We also have it in our liver. Bone is high there because that's where our red blood cells are being made. It's 34% of it is found in hemoglobin. Where are you going to find hemoglobin? In your red blood cells. 25% of it is found in myoglobin. Where would you find myoglobin?
White.
No,
Muscles.
in your muscles. So your myoglobin is what's holding the iron, and I'm not a muscle physiologist by any means, but so the more myoglobin that an animal has, the redder the meat's going to be, and that myoglobin is going to be able to hold on to the oxygen, which is then required for providing the oxygen to go through the electron transport chain to make enough ATP for the muscle contraction to keep on occurring. So because of that, typically what we're calling our slow twitch, our aerobic muscle fibers that you're going to be using in an endurance situation, those are your red muscles. So those are your, I don't remember which type they are, but your fast twitch are your white. They have less myoglobin, and that's because you're primarily using your anaerobic respiration to provide the ATP, and that's typically because you just need to get away really quick and you're not planning on running for a long period of time. So thinking about birds specifically, which ones would you expect to have high amounts of myoglobin in them that we're producing for food?
Sure.
Turkeys?
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't eat chickens because they're prey.
So you gotta think of what we've used. So naturally turkeys, wild turkey is gonna have redder meat. Domestic, not so much. Chickens, similar. The people that are consuming poultry, they want a white chicken breast, right? Because they're viewing that the white meat is healthier for them. you think of another poultry that would have like a red breast, duck,
That's all we have left.
Yeah,
It's not quail.
they're wild,
quail, pheasants are all gonna have,
that's right.
And it's like, it's not quail, right? Because they're so small.
yeah, you open up a quail, it's gonna be pretty red. Pheasants are gonna be red, ducks are gonna be red. Why do you think their breast muscle has so much more myoglobin?
Are they listed as, like, they're not as domestic as turkeys and chickens? So we haven't really bred that cow.
Pretty much. They're gonna be, if you're thinking naturally, they're gonna be flying more. So even chickens,
Also, they have better like cardio, like red blood cell counts, so they fly a lot more. But I'm thinking, that's why I'm thinking.
well, that's right, they evolved to fly long distances.
Yeah.
So even turkeys, they don't really fly. I mean, if you have wild turkeys, they can get up into the trees, but they're more like controlled falling, right? So they can kind of jump up into the trees and then they control fall down. It's not like they're gonna be able to take off and fly similar to chickens. They're doing the same thing, where ducks and pheasants and quail actually fly, and they evolved to fly for long periods of time, so they're gonna have much more myoglobin within their breast tissue, because those are the muscles that they're using while they're flying. So they're gonna have more myoglobin, and consequently, gonna have higher iron requirement. When we transfer iron in the blood, because iron is so caustic, right? It can react with things. If you have iron react with something in your car, what's going to happen to that component of the car?
It's gonna get hot.
I think so.
So what don't you want in a car? Think iron and metal,
Is it rust?
rust. So iron, and what is rust? What type of reaction is it?
Oxidation.
An oxidation reaction. So iron is our major contributor to our reactive oxygen species. We don't want free iron floating around. So anytime we're moving iron around, we transfer it in our blood with this molecule called transferrin. So it binds iron. If you're talking about mammals, the way we get iron into milk, it's bound to lactoferrin. Fun fact of the day, chicken transferrin, if you look at the genetic code, is more similar to human lactoferrin than it is to human transferrin. So chicken transferrin is actually lactoferrin. Structurally and genetically it matches up. But it doesn't make sense to call it lactoferrin in chickens because the lacto component is coming from lactation. So we still just call it transferrin. So that's your fun fact of the day. We're able to absorb only about 5 to 10% of it, and that all depends on the source. If you are feeding inorganic iron sources, so if it's iron sulfate, iron oxide, those have, and it depends if it's ferrous or ferric, those have a lower bioavailability to the animal. Do you guys know, I'm going to assume not you, Cooper, but Caitlin, have you ever been diagnosed as being anemic before?
No.
No.
My sister is.
Okay. What does the doctor tell your mom to do?
I think she has to take an
An iron pill? What if she didn't want to take a supplement? What would they recommend? Red meat. Why red meat? Because of the myoglobin. But that iron from the myoglobin and the hemoglobin is more available than if you get it from an inorganic source. So those are some of the things to keep in mind is if you're trying to get a more natural source, adding potentially a little bit of blood meal or bone meal may be more beneficial than having iron oxide. So, let's go ahead and get that some iron. Okay. So our deficiency in iron, your main deficiency symptom is going to be anemia. Now there are different types of anemia. We already learned about megaloblastic anemia, which what causes megaloblastic anemia. There's 2 vitamins.
That's all you have. It's vitamin E.
No? So it's folic acid and B12 will cause megaloblastic. So iron is causing microcytic anemia, to where these are very small red blood cells. So they're not able to, so you may have the hemoglobin, but you don't have the iron in the middle holding it all together. It results in a pale color. In a growing animal, you're going to have decreased growth rate. You're going to have listlessness, so they're going to be very fatigued, not very active. You'll get some wrinkled skin, a little bit of labored breathing. So labored breathing and the listlessness is because they don't have the oxygen. So if they don't have the oxygen, they can't make the ATP through the electron transport chain. The labored breathing, they're having to breathe harder to try and get more oxygen to bind to any of the hemoglobin at all. You can also get some fatty liver. Fatty liver results in the fact that we have it where even though we don't have enough ATP, we can't make it go through the electron transport chain, so that backs up into the TCA cycle, and so the products of the TCA cycle are going to cause citric acid to leave and make fats, because we're not going into the electron transport chain. So that's why you end up getting fatty liver with it. You can see a toxicity between 1 to 3 hours of being fed, and it all depends on the actual form. You can get lesions that form also. And I think we'll end here for today. Do you guys have any questions on?
What is the rush shape, leaching, or is that like?
I need to look those up again.